First of all, welcome for those who are in the Zoom, which is a CuratorLab group from 2019-2020, and our guest lecturers, Matteo Lucchetti and Judith Wielander, curators of Visible project, with whom we shared this last year. My name is Johanna Warscha. I'm the program director of CuratorLab at Konstfack University of Arts in Stockholm. And for those who don't know, just one word, one sentence, two sentences about CuratorLab. It's a freestanding course. We are actually very free. Every year we can work on another topic. And we try to work within the group of 10 independent, dependent, interdependent curators on ideas which go beyond the exhibition mode. So what is a curatorial beyond the exhibition mode? And how to debate with art the pertinent issues of our time, how to have collective fun, how to practice horizontal learning, and this kind of area, so to say. It's our terrain of study. And it's really my great pleasure somehow to welcome you to this program of democracy and dramaturgy notes of on curating socially engaged art. And today we start with a conversation of our guest lecturers. As I said, Matteo Lucchetti and Judith Wielander. And I have to thank you, Matteo and Judith, actually for taking us on this adventure. Because approximately 2 years ago, or maybe more, I don't remember exactly, you sent me an email with the proposal for CuratorLab to become advocates for socially engaged art and maybe the most exciting socially engaged artist initiatives of our times in a form of a staged parliament. That this one was happening in Hôtel de Ville in Paris, so not, a kind of special location, maybe the only time in the history of French Hôtel de Ville that the parliament was speaking English, probably. And so you took us upon this adventure, and the students advocated, which I would like to name maybe 3 things why I think it was such an important and incredible experience. First of all, you made us think about advocacy as a curatorial form, because as curators, we give guided tours, we write curatorial statements, we write labels, and there is a lot of text production around the artwork. But what it actually means to be an advocate. So what it means to filter with your body, with your senses, to stand for a project and somehow deliver it, maybe not exactly as an artist thinks, but yet, of course, in accordance with the artist, but also with the whole world of this artistic production. So I found this extremely important throughout this year. Second thing, you made us think a lot about what it is for art to become visible outside of our art bubble. And this is why the organization also is called Visible, right? Like, what is it for art to become part of something else? And you took us on this journey. And thirdly, I also wanted to thank you so much for actually giving us all this trust, because you came to CuratorLab and you offered for 9 young curators to take over a parliament you have been building for a couple of years, and that you have been very meticulously curating. But here, somehow, without even knowing the people before we made the call, you kind of offered and shared this, you put a lot of vulnerability in this format and offered the advocacy and offered it as a really experimental platform. So I guess it has been an amazing educational model and an amazing blind date, so to say, for both sides. So now, who was actually on this date? I guess on one side, of course, the Visible, but on the other side, also the participants of CuratorLab. I will name them shortly. So Sara Alberani from Rome, who will actually act as a main moderator today. Pia Chakraverti-Würthwein, who is a bit late and will join us in a few minutes. Gilad from Stockholm. Carolina Leo from London. Carlota from Vienna. Sofia Steinvorth from Lisbon, Claudia Stübi from Bern, Ben G. Thomas, maybe also joining us a bit later. And technical side and coordination is made by curatorial assistant of CuratorLab, Vasco Forconi, who was also the student last year. And the whole project and the whole research was in collaboration and partnership with, of course, Visible Project, Public Art Agency in Stockholm, and Italian Culture Institute in Stockholm. Before giving it over to you, just to say this parliament in Paris was the first parliament with CuratorLab, but also obviously the last one, because you are actually changing the form, and it was the last time Visible was in a form of an award, and you take it somewhere else from there. And I guess this is what we'll be debating today. So what does it really mean to curate socially engaged art, and how to push institutions to rethink art beyond consumption, extraction, and other models we are maybe part of and used to, and what can we do as curators, and actually young curators of tomorrow too. So I'm very much looking forward to this, and welcome everyone again, and you too. And give it over to Vasco for some comments about technical side.
Yes, just a few technical informations. The conversation will last approximately 45 minutes, and then there will be space for questions from the audience. So for those who are following us on Facebook in the streaming, they can ask questions or comment through the comment section in the video. And yes, we will open up the conversation. For those who are in the Zoom, please keep your microphone turned off so there won't be unwanted noises. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Vasco and Joanna. I'm part of the CuratorLab group of this year. I'm Sara Alberani, an independent curator from Rome, and I introduce the guests of our conversation, Matteo Lucchetti and Judith Wielander, that are the curators of the Visible project. So Visible is an art institution by Cittadellarte-Fondazione Pistoletto and Fondazione Zegna, and researches and sustains socially engaged art practices in a global context. And what you find are artistic approaches that have the capacity to connect up different worlds, and often through alliances with territories, artists, thinkers, public and private institutions. And the areas of actions bring today's economic and political decision-making models into a very serious question. And the benefits are not those of self-referential actions in art-based context, but the target is the creation of alternative models of public action. So, ciao Matteo, ciao Judith, and thank you for being here. I would say that is great to share this public moment after our reflections of the last month together. So I start with the first question for you on the curatorial methodologies of Visible and what we mean by socially engaged art, because Visible is a very heterogeneous reality. We have met you in so different forms, as a support structure and a web archive for socially engaged art practices. I have to say a very generous, useful knowledge platform. I say this as an independent curator because I have used it a lot in order to learn more about what the artists are doing all over the world. And Visible is also a space for sharing knowledge among us, among CuratorLab for the first time, also for you. Visible is, of course, a biennial award that is your most important project. We have acted as advocate for 10, I have to say, great artistic projects, and we have learned a lot from the example, from the models, from the practicality. Advocacy as a new experience for us as curators. I mentioned the artists with which we have worked. There were Richard Bell, Cooking Sections, Forensic Architecture, Daniel Godinez-Nivon, Emily Jassir, Marisa Moranjan, Luke Ching, Trampoline House, Autobahn Kanga, and Jasmine Patija. So after this big event of the award, now we reflect about the possibility of engage in a long-term relationship with you as an art institution. One way in which we are doing this is an upcoming publication with all these artists, with you, with Andrea Phillips, and a so-called proposition on translocal solidarity that will be ready, we hope, by this year, and then this public program online. So I come to the question that is, I love the sentence in which Visible defines itself, that is, where art leaves its own field and becomes visible as part of something else. So how have you acted in these past 10 years in the own field and into the something else?
Thank you, Sara, and hello to everybody that is connected now. Of course, it's so great to see you all here. We wish this would happen in real life, but for now we're still living the digital fever. So let's surf on it for a while more. And yeah, we are also so glad to have the time to reflect back on what we did together, and also to take this opportunity to really have the opportunity with our collaborators, because that's what you've been for the last year. So working with us on the project, and to really look at how things have evolved and how things can also evolve in a different way in the future. So, but without further ado, I go to the answer to your question. And with Judith, we decided also to try to respond to each question, each of us. So maybe Vasco, if you see one of us is speaking too much, let us know. So it might happen, especially from my side. So this subtitle that you quote is actually coming from Raimundas Malasauskas. That was one of the 10 curators that were chosen to start, let's say the sharing of the curatorial research from the very beginning. That was the book that Judith Wielander with Angelika Burcher curated together. And that was the start. And you have to imagine also, to give you a little bit of context, you have to imagine this took form inside an artist funded and run institution that is Pistoletto Foundation, and visible from the beginning, thanks to the relationship with another foundation, Zegna Foundation, became a sort of research unit. So the idea was to have a sort of satellite within the foundation in order to really start to deconstruct all the Western genealogy of the concepts that we were working with every day within the foundation. So namely the concept of what public art was, the conception of public space, public domain, even the idea of how art and society were connected to each other. It was something that we wanted to, let's say, put inside this research machine and see how multifaceted could be the result. So how much more complex, varied could be the kind of multiple storytellings and narrations that were coexisting in a post-89 and therefore a globalized context of art. So the sentence really rang the bell, and that's why we kept it, and really was a statement that was telling a lot, because one thing we completely understood was also how a main mission of this research on socially engaged artistic practices, that, just to remind you, started in 2009. So we're talking about more than 10 years ago. It was really the sentence that would frame how, in order to start to look back to social engagement in art, we should really also start to really take at heart the idea that there were practices that were visible as art, but also as something else. So the idea that there was like a manifestation of artistic practices that needed to be researched, needed to be found elsewhere, not in the usual places. So that's why from the beginning we understood that it was important to share the curatorial research in a horizontal way. And we always had, as curators of the platform, we always had the idea of having other curators joining us in telling us where to look. And most of these people were people that were not only looking, but they were also doing. They were practicing in order to practicing artistic work or curatorial work in order to make space for certain practices to exist, to exist in the in-betweens of the art system, of course, in all its different representations. Another thing that was very vital from the beginning, also coming from an artist-initiated institution, was to think that our research needed to be always put into practice in the way we were thinking the project itself. So we always kept an eye very open and very, let's say, porous towards the formats, the forms of organizations, the kind of methodologies that artists were coming up with. So for instance, even the parliament itself, the temporary parliament, that certainly is a curatorial format that we developed, but it was also coming from the observation of many artists who were trying to use the space of assembling, the space of getting together as a space of production of knowledge. And so we thought, if we are meant to create spaces where there is an assessment of what is social engagement in art today, then we also need to learn from those artists that are experimenting with the formats that can allow us to turn this into a learning opportunity. So just to say that our, let's say, curatorial approach has been from the beginning the one of self-questioning what format could really serve the artists we were interested in, and of course not just the artists, but the projects that these artists were giving shape to. Another thing that is important to mention is also this idea of the flexibility, and this comes with the idea that you said that Visible is an institution, but it actually is incorrect, because we never named it an institution, not because we have anything with institutions, but just to say that our institution is Cittadellarte-Fondazione Pistoletto, but that is also a great, let's say, opportunity for us, in the sense that, you know, we don't have to, institutions also have to be recognizable. They need to stay true to themselves. Sometimes they get stuck in what they need to constantly perform about themselves. So for us, being a satellite, as I mentioned before, was also an opportunity to let's say, put at work all that knowledge that we were gathering through the research of the curatorial formats we were experimenting with, and to put this at work in a sense of like transforming also the way we were doing things. So that's why we went from, you know, a behind closed door jury, then Judith also after will tell you more about this, we went to the temporary parliament, but it was always the kind of motion that goes from let's say, adopting what we were understanding urgent, important, pivotal from artists, and the idea of developing a discourse that would reflect the complexity that the artists were coming with. So to really always stay true to this kind of double gesture. I don't know, maybe Judith.
So maybe I continue. And yes, I think what was for us also a very, very crucial decision, because when we decided to use the format of an award, we were saying it was, we didn't like the format in itself, because we found it's always very problematic to grant someone, because I think an artist doesn't need to deserve something, but he wants just to do his practice. But what we were like saying also is that it was interesting not to award the practice or the artist himself or herself or a collective, but really the project, because immediately it gave us another idea of impacting also on the practice itself, but also how this project that is developed in a very situated context, how this project can also impact by another collectivity. And very often it is developed in exchange with a collectivity, but the fact also that it's developed in a very specific context, it has a big potential to have an impact. And for us, this was already exciting, because this brought us immediately also to the question to do this kind of practices that are developed outside of the institutional framework, that have maybe a completely different dialogue also to an audience or to someone who is experiencing the artwork in that sense. So for us, this was also an important focus, because we were always conceiving the project in relation to others. It was not in relation to one system, but it was in relation to different ecosystems, to different communities, to different audiences, and to different knowledge systems. So for us, this was a very important methodology also. Therefore, we were immediately also sharing the research, sharing our experience with others from the inside, from sharing it with other institutions, with other curators, with other researchers, but also outside, in the sense beyond the museum walls. It was also, we were supporting that it became quickly not only one experience, but it became a local network of experiences, because this was also the way we wanted to direct a little bit the perspective of the institutions, to show them also that it was interesting to work with these practices through the award and through the research and collaborating with the other curators, because we were not just discussing the 10 shortlisted projects, but also before the parliament. It was, I would like to remind also that we have always had a biennial collaboration with the museum, and this biennial collaboration with the museum was also the reason because we wanted to bring a certain discourse and certain kind of practice inside the institutional context, who was not very much, maybe who had completely different spaces, curatorial spaces also to represent and to promote this kind of project. So in a certain way, we wanted to bring inside also this multiplicity of practices to inspire the museums also how they could work in a different way with these practices that are maybe not commissioned for an exhibition space, but these are long-term practices who need the context that is represented by the reality and by the transformative reality, because very often these kind of practices are very closely related to social movements, and also in that sense it was important that they are not detached, that we are not extracting them from their context, but it was rather a dialogue that we could build, in the sense also that we, maybe the museum, we could help the museums also to reach out to communities that maybe are very far away. So in that sense, for us, Visible is never only the award, it's never only research, it's never only a project that has, it's really an organic project that is, the practice is implemented through the research, through the network that we are creating, and also through this circulation of different knowledges and propositions that we are also developing together with, as we do with other master programs that we involved this year in the parliament, but also with institutions and also with the artists, because this is one of the most important connection for us are the artists and artistic collectives, that in that sense we are constantly re-asking what are the needs now, what will then be the needs in 2 years, and what will be maybe the needs in next future. And how can we help also and create a dynamic insight in this institution to change formats and infrastructures to offer a better space also for the artists to develop their project, or not space only, but also support and the benefits for them, that they have not to abandon their project to show it in a museum, and but that they can do both, that they can develop the project inside and also open these processes to other artists and the different audiences.
Super. Hey, Judith. I'm gonna take over and try and unpack with you both the experience of the parliament together, because I'm sure that for some of the people listening to us today, they don't really know what went on in the parliament, what it was exactly, who was there, how things developed. So I think it's important to set that framework, and I have some questions also related to what you think of it as a format that you may no longer want to continue with, and why, and so on. But first of all, I wanted to give this overview. So the parliament is really the visible curators, then there is a moderator, then there is the jury, which is often comprised by people that are akin but not necessarily from inside the art world. And then this year there was us, the 10 advocates for the 10 projects, and it was the last one in Paris. So it was the Hotel de Ville, which is the city council, And of course, for me, from my personal experience of the parliament, I have to say that the most striking element was maybe the spatial experience. So really inhabiting the power structure and enacting the advocacy in a way, because we had to be persuasive, but we also had to be quite severe. We had to modulate our language. We had 3 minutes to convey an entire project that's been, going on for however many years. So we really had to play both games at the same time. Sometimes I felt like perhaps I was doing a bit of a TED talk almost, but also we had other moments where we almost became like politicians, because we had 1 minute to summarize, the final statement and make sure to convince the parliament to vote for our project. So in this sense, I think that as a curatorial experience, it was really unlike anything personally that I've ever done before. And I think that performativity, if you will, is kind of at the core. And then, of course, we had Andrea Phillips moderating, which I think is super interesting. And I think it may have to do with this thing that Matteo was talking about pushing formats and questioning formats as you do the format, because her work revolves around, literally, I quote her CV, the economic and social construction of public value within contemporary art and the manipulation and potential of forms of participation in art and curating. Quite wordy, but she likes to question things as she participates in them as well. So the first question would be, I will post them all at the same time and then you develop in your own time, but the first question would be how the alliance with Andrea came about, and how she also envisaged the role, because she'd been an advocate before, and how that developed as well. And then I'm just interested in teasing out some of the stuff she writes about. There's an essay that she's written which is called Doing Democracy, and she writes about participatory art, and she sort of points out the ways in which sometimes participation becomes not the excuse, but like a medium to create an image of democracy. So she talks a lot about the image of democracy and democracy as utopia. And she says that democracy as utopia is only possible as a mise en scène, so as theater, and something that works inside a bubble. And then she, on one hand, says that one of these uses is to maintain a political system. But on the other hand, she does say that the art world creates a set of possibilities to try other things that may enact change. So I guess the $1 million question is, what's your position vis-a-vis this her ideas as well, and why you chose the parliament. And then I'll keep the third one for when you first, because the third one is more about what comes next, maybe.
I think for us it was also this a very the parliament in end was a moment that had many previous moments also, because we started the idea of the public jury was also in a certain way, as Matteo was pointing out, not to all this knowledge that all this discussion that we had in the first edition behind closed door, how we can share this knowledge with the public. And so we started to say, let's go public, and we started a format that was not a parliament in 2030, but it was still with jury members, with the public in front. It was more or less 70 persons that could interact, but only in 2015 then with Andrea. And probably also because we get to know her in different occasions, and we appreciated very much her openness, and also to go for a risk. And I think this was is a very interesting thing that for me and Matteo was always important, because we're always saying we have nothing to lose, let's go, let's risk, and let's fail. And in that sense, to go also then in a real parliament in Liverpool.
The job, nothing to lose except a job.
Yeah, but and then
we say that is also true for me as well.
And in Liverpool, it was really like a very natural and organic decision to give confidence to share this risk together with Andrea, and I think it was an amazing choice to do that. And of course, it was always formats we felt, we were very interested, but we felt immediately also that it was problematic. There were many things that were problematic. But what we were saying also in that sense because the jury is always a decision-making process, so we wanted to experiment with that. And only experiment, you can test it out and understand what is working, what is not working, what is better. But it was maybe the most natural format also to bring together people and in around one day to discuss these projects. Of course, it would have been wonderful if we could have discussed this project publicly 3 days, but we had to make some decisions, and we could not do everything that what we would have liked to do. But I think also we were very aware more about the symbolic value, and the performative attitude was very, very strictly close to this symbolic value, as we are also saying, we give an award, a production budget of 25,000 euros to one project. We could have also said also we give 5,000 to several projects, but we wanted to give a statement also that this kind of projects need a minimum of this of such a budget to have an impact. In the same way, it's also with the parliament, it was a symbolic act, and in that sense, this is something that we are continuing to do, because of course we have limited possibilities, but we think it's very important now to re-question the museum, re-question politics of collecting, politics of acquisitions, politics of supporting and displaying and presenting art, but through symbolic acts also, because otherwise it's something, the change is coming in a very, it's not from today to tomorrow, but it's something that has to be to happen in a very organic way. So for us, the parliament was a symbolic moment of acting maybe, and to give the possibility also to us to play with curatorial formats like a discursive format like this, because we think in a certain way we were always with Visible also refusing to do exhibition, because so we could experiment with other formats, because we think it's very important that this kind of practices need maybe sometimes different formats and more freedom. So this was a way also to experiment this. And in Paris, it was amazing because we offered you the possibility to experiment with that. And we didn't know in the beginning how it will be. It was really also because you were putting inside also your way of creating this kind of interventions and advocacy.
I'd like to add that what you quote from Andrea is very much at the core of also why we did what we did, because when Andrea says that democracy is a mise-en-scène, also points out the representational aspect of democracy that also offers a set of rules that almost everybody understand and almost everybody play by those rules, let's say in a certain, let's say, majority of the world, of course. But also we have kind of lost the idea that in this mise-en-scène, in this play, we kind of lost the possibility of altering the script in some way. So, and I think that for us, we really saw an opportunity when the occasion to use the city council in Liverpool arised, to also say, of course, it's a symbolic gestures, but on the other hand, it's also like going back to what we were saying before about art that is visible as something else. So what if that's something else, that is, for instance, the way democracy look like, the way democracy work, that is something that is certainly understandable by more people than what contemporary art is. So the same mother understand how a parliament work, but not necessarily understand how a contemporary art museum operates. So we thought perhaps, because these projects are really trying to shape reality otherwise, they're really in their locales, they're so busy like inventing new ways of doing the things that we do every day, but with a shift, with another perspective, by altering these things. How can we stay true to the kind of invention of the everyday life on a daily basis and bring it to the place where the everyday life and its rules are shaped every day? So that was really like a way of understanding the press for those projects, as also Judith was pointing out towards end, that maybe they're more fit into a city council than into a museum. When I need to speak about, you know, the Rojava Parliament by Jonas Sal, or I need to speak about the Litau's Bay platform to discuss about the right to their housing in a context of anti-squatting laws, or, you know, just to make the first two that came to my mind, how much more meaningful could be to bring this knowledge into that kind of space. And of course, we are a small institution, you know, it's always being played more as a gestures than as a, you know, kind of operational kind of gesture, sorry, operational kind of strategy. But for instance, you know, it grew edition by edition. So for instance, a big achievement of the last edition was that those projects were also discussed through these short videos on national French television. And that was for us was also a great achievement of using the Hôtel de Ville. So of course we were being played by the theater. So of course when we immediately got inside, we started to perform as we know democracy looks like. You know, I remember you, Carlota, playing the Speaker of the Parliament asking for order. You know? And it's interesting because of course we were being played by the room, but on the other hand, how could we play the room towards the direction that we want to steer this, let's say, visibility and this potential of the project elsewhere in the something else. So I think that there, I think it's where also the meeting with Andrea started in some way and continued. And when we secured the room, we couldn't think of anybody else but Andrea to be there.
No, I think it's the best choice. I mean, but it's really interesting what you're saying in terms of, you know, the room playing us, because I feel like, at least in our experience, it wasn't only us who got into this sort of frantic advocacy mode, but also the people in the jury. There was an uprising because they wanted to change the rules and they wanted to. So and then I think you mentioned that it's not the first time that it happens. So I think it's interesting in terms of offering this format to a group of people who have to, you know, make a decision, and then they take it very seriously and they begin to question also that format. I think it's interesting, especially if it keeps repeating itself.
No, completely. But that's also why we observed through the different editions the same, as you say, reactions, but also because there is a power in the assembly that people perceive and they feel like they can make, even if it's a small one, they can have an impact. They can take a decision together. And unfortunately, we live in such a representational democracy that we observe this as a play where we have no part anymore. So to feel that for a moment you can make a difference, you can distribute a reasonable amount of money towards one project rather than another, people get heated up and then they want to question the power. Where is the power? And then when they realize that we are all sharing that responsibility, then, you know, they start to work on it. But before, of course, you need to break those kind of barriers.
Super.
Yes.
Sorry to interrupt, but since Andrea is with us, she joined us a little bit later. So first, I wanted to welcome you, Andrea, and you know, great to have you. And we'll have a seminar with you tomorrow. But maybe you would like to jump in if you just have a short comment, since so much was about your role in the
Well, it's immense. Thank you so much, Joanna, and it's great to be here. And I don't want to say too much today because I'm going to say a lot more tomorrow. But the one other framework I think is really interesting in both of the visible award processes that I've been involved in, or of course I've watched the other ones, the 2013 from a distance. But the 2015 and the
15 and 19.
15 and 19. So the 15, I mean, I think there's also very interesting specific context to those architectural scenarios or mise en scène as well. So, and we might discuss it a little bit in a text that I've kind of circulated tomorrow, but there's for for British people, there's very specific resonances to Liverpool City Hall. So, and maybe we'll talk about that tomorrow, but just to remind everybody as well, and maybe people that are listening that weren't there, that also as another wrap, as another layer of the serious theatre with which we were dealing in Paris last year, was the Gilets jaunes protest that was occurring outside, which was a kind of really interesting, the resonances are absolutely significant in terms of the history of Parisian European politics of the formation of parliamentarianism. You know, the refractions back to the sans-culottes, to the Paris Commune, you know, which we were almost sitting on top of this kind of the bones of this kind of historically formulated utopia that we were kind of trying to recreate in one day, but surrounded by this kind of moment of sans-culottes / gilets jaunes demand for different forms of democracy, for different forms of listening, in which, there were moments in which I think Matteo and Judith were emailing me in the morning saying, you're going to have to be accompanied by 3 policemen into the, all of this was also like heightening the situation. So I think, our experiences were really also formed by that. And to a certain extent, I think it inculcated in all of us a sense of a kind of a demand and a panic, a kind of panic to demand that we got through this. We had a deadline. I mean, otherwise we would have gone on for a lot longer, I guess. So there was also something else going on there as well that is really worth bearing in mind. And maybe, there's a really extended essay that needs to be thought through in relationship to that political scenario, which is still, of course, ongoing in Paris, in France and across Europe right now, and is exacerbated because of COVID. So just to put that in.
Thank you. Sara.
Yes, thank you, Andrea, and welcome. And yes, we follow in specifically the research about curating social engaged art, that I find as a curator that sounds something strange, because social engaged art are locally based, maybe community based, participated. So the curatorial practice as a method is something that starts quite often from theory, from research, something that is also not fitted so much the everyday life. It's something that I would love to discuss with you. And because we are speaking from the global north, even now, we are all connected from different cities all over Europe. And even in this CuratorLab group, we are 9 independent curators speaking from the global north, but our issues are related to the global south, thanks to the artists, the practices that are based in urgent territories and are in relationship between Western society and other part of the world. So while we were discussing in Hôtel de Ville in Paris, outside Gilets jaunes were manifesting exactly against the decision of that classroom. And we have spoken about it. Even during the parliament, there was this contradiction in terms. And now we're still speaking from a role that is one of the curators. We feel the contradiction of our role, and because it's still recognized through an established and conservative artistic system. And we act within this conservative system. For example, the canons that decide the art collections, the numerals, biennials, events, bulimia, and also the cultural consumerism that extracts content from the urgency of the present and then represent the same contents in the neutrality of the white cube of the space exhibition. So I also remember about the collection, about the notion of collection, a discussion that we had together with the colonizing architecture in Stockholm, with Sandro Pettis and Gilad. They were claiming how many of their projects that are local-based, community-based, participated, requires responsibility not only coming from the artists, but also from that institution that were collecting and exhibiting that work. So we have discussed a lot how an institution can act as a subject that is present in long-term based project that is very difficult, and also how if so much has been done from the individuals, from curators, artists that bring contents, how to change the system in which these contents are then put, the system that reproduces the same exploitative canons that we are trying to fight. So in these contradictional terms, how to question the system and the institution by addressing socially engaged art practices, and which structures we can think to support the artists in these projects.
Mm-hmm. I think for us also, it was very interesting to also to see that the practices, this kind of practices, are art processes that are developed within a context, with a context. So in that sense, for us also, curating is very much related, has such a layer always, and so that therefore there are not only one curatorial format but many formats, and in that sense we are also approaching the institutional context, because also there what we are interested is now also to put in questions infrastructure that has been developed by the institutions and has been also preserved in the last decades from their point of view. So what we are now going back in this moment of transformation of the project, very much to the beginning of our research, because one of the first questions that we were discussing also with Michelangelo, with Cittadellarte, with Fondazione Zegna, who were our partners, and we had to convince them, was really also because there was the idea of collecting artworks, processes that are bounded to the production to an object, that are really object-based. And for us, the first natural question was, why not collecting artistic processes like that, artistic practices that are rooted in a social context? So in that sense, now after 10 years, we are saying maybe now we have also a certain experience, we've developed strategies, we can in a certain way now also question another infrastructure of the museum, that is the collection. Because related to the collection, there is also, it's related to acquisitions, it's related to choices. And so for us, this was a very interesting role of the museum as a producer of culture, also to question this issue, also how to include in the collections of the museums projects that are intangible, projects that are based on relations and that are developed with a very autonomous rhythm, and are not maybe responding to commissions or to requests of a museum program. And in that sense, for us, it's really interesting also that these questions are bringing us also to rethink what kind of ethical frameworks, this kind of new ways also to collect or to support art projects need. And this is a big discussion that we are doing now every day with other institutions, with other organizations, how to change these ways of dealing with art or supporting art.
And also, I think it's important to say that you mentioned, Sara, the question was very complex. I mean, I don't know, I think we started with Gilets jaunes, we passed to the white cube, and we ended, I don't know where precisely, so I'm trying here, so I might be off. But what I want to say is that in this constant thinking that Judith has pointed out, that has been with us along the curating of this project, we always had in the back of our mind also, how can, allow certain historiography, certain certain art history that is about social engagement to be part of the, let's say, collective history that museums are supposed to write. So we also thought, you know, and of course, if you think of the case of Tania Bruguera with Arte Utile, she pointed out there a kind of how to say, scission, a kind of rupture, I would say, or something like the moment in art history that she realizes there are like two art histories. There is the one, of course, of the rise of the museum, of the white cube and so on. And as if, as in opposition to that, kind of developed a kind of art that at its core the possibility to be useful in some form. And now, you know, banalizing the project of Tania, but what I want to say is that in this idea of collecting that we are now trying to take on board, there is also a serious rethinking of the category through which then this art that we are working on, that we are supporting, that we are researching, that we are connecting one with the other. It's also a concern of how to write a collective history where these practices, this work are part of the storytelling that is going to be told in the future. So, and in that sense, we thought institutions nowadays, and when I say institution, I also think of the state that makes money available to collect artworks, but also, you know, private initiatives that do that. How much, you know, in that the principles are completely different. There is many times not an attempt to write a collective history, but rather to play within the art system, what is trendy, what is good, what is valuable, and so on. So because of the reputation we gained in 10 years and the possibility to, as Judith said, also to have a dialogue au pair with other art institutions that are museums, that are private foundations, art organizations, we also thought, how can we steer a conversation around this? So really, and then COVID happened. And maybe we're going to talk more about this, but this actually for us was great because many people that would normally be not available to talk about these issues immediately became not only available, but in need to share certain thoughts. So this became really an incredible opportunity within the crisis we all experienced, where we really had the time to rethink what it meant for Visible to start to include in its platform the idea of collecting social engaged art. And another thing that I want to point out without making it too long is also about because also you did like this kind of history, let's say, curve, but also like it's important to think also how we stay true to the possibility of curating being instrumental to the artistic vision. So of course, you know, we live in a time where everybody produces images and everybody now is also the curator of its own images through digital platforms, through many other sources. So what is still meaningful about what we do, and what is still meaningful about our role when it comes to, you know, juxtaposing images? Is this really that we are doing, or is it any use for artists, artistic vision, to have people like just fulfilling this kind of roles that were the roles of the curator in a more like display-oriented kind of situation? Everything is display right now. So, and this goes back maybe to what we talked about in the beginning when Joanna introduced this. So for us, when we also proposed CuratorLab, the collaboration, we had in mind, how can we start more in a constructive way to start a relationship with emerging curators like you, to really pose this question in a plurality of answers, you know, to try to listen about the possibilities. And we thought with Joanna, for instance, we had from the beginning this ongoing joke about the Pussy Riot, because what was the question, Joanna? Sorry.
Well, how to not curate Pussy Riot. I mean, how to engage, and obviously you cannot curate it in like what Sara was saying, conservative meaning of the term, but you can be present as a curator. So how are you present? Yeah, how you are in the picture and yet just not display? Because if you ask them or Vina Group, if you can make an exhibition, they would say, sure, I mean, do whatever you want. You know, you can print whatever you want. So yeah, you like everyone can just do an exhibition of them. But if you want to be a committed curator, you have to do something else. This is what, like, how they engage with artists.
Exactly. So already in the negation, how to not curate Pussy Riot is also the idea of how to invent, you know, formats that become meaningful in supporting an artistic vision that doesn't need to be put on display, but need to be put in relationship with meaningful agents and possibilities and resources to really thrive towards an utopia, as Andrea talked about, also the idea of also this democratic gesture. No? So I don't know if I answered your question, but
one of the questions.
One of them.
Yes, it was an overall on curating, and of course it's very good that it's multiforms and diverse as this complex system.
Can I bring up an anecdote? Sorry to take time, but I think just to also go a bit out of the theory, but just to say, like, I remember when with Judith we invited Miguel Lopez to curate a show in Brussels about the Peruvian artist Giuseppe Campuzano that was nominated but unfortunately passed away. So we decided to do this exhibition in Brussels. So that was one of the few cases where we thought the exhibition was an important thing to do. It was the first time that the exhibition of the Museum of Transvestitism was coming in Europe. Then afterwards it was bought by Reina Sofia. And we did it in Brussels. And from the beginning, we did it within an art school, in the gallery of an art school, and we got in touch with people working in the LGBT communities and also in the Pride. And that year, the Gay Pride of Brussels had as a poster image and a work of Giuseppe Campuzano. So talking about, you know, how to not curate, you know, you can even go through the form of an exhibition, but you need to be aware, you know, that your strategies will need to show responsibility and show, as Joanna says, an idea of being present to that practice. And for us to be present to that practice in the specific moment was, how can we convey the message of Campuzano of non-binary gender theory, of like colonization also of the gender aspect of life, and to do it in a way that would also become an image that would trigger many conversations. So this is just an example that is very practical, but how to deal with a material that is so activist, is so important, at the same time not to just put it on show like anybody could do.
Well, I'm gonna jump in right there. Matteo, following up on something that you just mentioned about COVID, of course, which has led to an increased visibility of the precarious situation of a lot of artists, but also art workers around the world. And which, in a way, the pandemic, it has brought up a conversation about sustainability, not only for environmental reasons, but also working rights and precisely in the art world. Mm-hmm. And I remember this was also, the sustainability was one of the most important criteria when we were discussing the projects in the parliament. So when we think about the crisis that we are now going through, we are also talking about what would be options to find alternatives to not go back to the so-called normality, and what could be possibilities to find sustainable models, which is also what Visible is developing. But we are also seeing how the nation-state paradigm is again getting stronger, and the way in which social distancing is affecting our rights, the way we work, the way we relate. This is a good example also of how this is changing, and our presence or not in public space. So in this scenario of the pandemic, and also thinking about socially engaged art projects, we are taking on new forms between a very local experience, not being able to move as much as we were before, and also from a kind of excitement of having a lot of digital content that maybe we were not able to reach before, to maybe the feeling of being completely overwhelmed and not knowing how to choose and what to assist and what not, what is meaningful. and also our relationships moving into this digital sphere being Zoomified. Mm-hmm. And we were wondering, how do you see the role of socially engaged art practices right now, which of course it's super fresh. We don't have the critical distance to say what will happen or so on. But how might this also be a fertile ground to talk about these practices and what their role might be within this restructuring and experimenting with new formats?
I think for us, this project was always because we recognized also in this long-term project that these are the most fragile projects also in relation to sustainability, to foundings, and in that sense, we wanted to work on supporting new models of supporting these practices. And it was interesting also in this last month, we were discussing a lot about founding, how to found, and where can we find these foundings. We will need to create these multiple situated fellowships that we are now putting in place together with other organizations for this kind of projects. And it was interesting that a certain moment we were also saying, because it was a discussion that we're saying, okay, and now we do fundraising. And with Matteo, we are always discussing and saying why fundraising economy cannot be more close to the practices itself, that also the practices has also from the beginning on in a certain way a thinking also that is finding also economies for developing this practice should be something that is going with the practices, not something that is coming from outside or after. And in that sense, we were also saying to the organizations we were discussing with, maybe we don't need so much new foundings and other findings, but maybe we have just to see what is there and how we can shift things. And in that sense also we have seen that the collections, the acquisition budgets of the museum are very often very, very high. And it's a lack of language, it's a lack of narration, it's a lack of how to speak, you know, how to justify also to abort why one artist or one practice can be bought for a collection and not another one. So in that sense, for us, this is really also to become a methodology, really first to rethink the things and then reinvent together, discussing what we have and then change the relations in between and to find new ways. So for us, the collection budgets or the collections are a big resource that are totally not, there is missing a lot of narrations, how we can to include this kind of practices and support them. And I think it's really also in this potentiality to bring together different practices in the network, also to show that these are now ways of working of artists that are really not just one way of working, but with the archive, we are showing also that it's a big network of people that have chosen to work in a different way than artists that are just referring to the white cube or to the institutional context. So this is also, we see that in this moment that the institutions are getting aware that it's something that they need to include in their institutional context, in their various workings and promoting art. And therefore, we think that there are also many budgets and economical resources that we have just to show, and to reuse in another way.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe also it's important to point out, I think, that what we experienced in this COVID time was like going two opposite directions. So on one hand, there was an acceleration of the self-exploitation that we all exercise constantly on a daily basis, of self-exploiting ourselves. And actually in the cultural field, this was very much promoted and supported, because of course there was this kind of anxiety from institutions to lose a public they never had, and like to find one that they were ever looking for. And like this was the moment, this is the time we can finally meet all those people that will never enter our doors. So it was like this kind of race of like producing new content. Parallel to that, there was also a lot of people that took it in an interesting way. And also, as Judith was pointing out, also like, let's stop and look back and try to change the position through which we have looked at things. And of course, this was an opportunity for many artists also that are working socially engaged to rethink what is really my kind of engagement with the kind of topics I'm interested in. So just to bring up some examples, for instance, Jasmine Pateja worked on what she called Building Care Capacity Project. So the recipient of the award started to work in order to develop platforms online and offline on teaching ourselves how the idea of care that is always in our mouth all the time could be something that, you know, we need to build the capacity to care. And therefore, this was maybe the right time to help each other, like sharing experiences of care, being there even just to listen to somebody. There is this project she did, How Are You, where she connected completely unknown people in a blind kind of situation. But of course, it was not about dating, but it was about having the opportunity to share with a full stranger your experience of the quarantine, of the isolation, and across the globe. So to really have I had, for instance, a conversation with a girl in New Delhi that was extremely touching. But just even for the fact that we were able to connect on, we talked about everything, work, art, and this was an opportunity, you know, to really have a sincere conversation that unfortunately we were very much missing in this kind of race I mentioned before. And also, just last thing to say that many artists also were already working on, let's say, on a more digital space. I can think of, like, sorry if I mentioned him 2 times, it's not my habit, but like Jonas Talo with the collectivizing of Facebook, or, you know, other artists that started, Rossella Biscotto, that started the project on a migration camp in Greece. I think it also, for many people, it was the right time to step back from the kind of performativity of their own role or their business as usual, and to also re-experience a bit the reason why they're doing what they're doing. So I think it was an important time, and especially with Visible, we are also aiming to talk about this maybe in the future, also to gather some storytelling around what it meant for many socially engaged projects, because I think it's also like a kind of knowledge that it's not out there yet.
I would love to open up to the question coming from the audience that we have on Facebook, because there is one related to the current situation, not only the Corona one, but from Anna Michaela Ekstrand. She asked, you have mentioned Corona multiple times. However, I'm curious to hear what you think about the current protest against systemic racism in America and protests in US and across the world, constructive curating, dramaturgy, mise-en-scène, democratic gestures, utopian thinking, etc. Basically, I'm curious to hear how some of the questions from the project translate into this current moment of anti-racist protest.
Yeah, easy question. Who wants to start?
I think for us, in a certain, it was once we started to open up our research, because we were 2, and we were saying we are not academics, we don't know how to do research in a global context to get an overview on all different kind of artistic projects. So we were really like starting to invite people to share with us the research from the first edition on. So every year we were collaborating with 30 curators to understand what kind of interesting practices, with what kind of interesting practices they are working, or if they know them. So for us, it was immediately from 2, we became a big collectivity. And this big collectivity was in a certain way a guarantee that it was also very, there were very multiple perspectives in that sense. And we have to say that all the shortlist projects or the recipients, for example, also they were all not European artistic collectives. They were very often coming from very different cultural contexts. And this was interesting because working and on this kind with these artists and on their projects, we learned a lot also to look to the things in a completely different way. And of course, we were not working in an institutional context, so it was really we approached the practices in a very open way, and these artistic practices very often are strongly related with social movements. So these issues were always part of the projects we were in a certain way working with.
Yeah, I do think that it's not something that we need to react now, as Judith says. It's these kind of projects have always been there, and of course they are, or let's say the projects that deal with the questions that the question refers to. So the current anti-racist protests across the U.S. and of course across the world. I mean, it was James Baldwin that said, that the problem, let's say, the future of the US was related to the future of this issue, and this is like a kind of boiling pot that was meant to explode. I mean, structural violence has been exponentially growing, and not only, of course, in the US. So these conversations are coming to the surface, and I think in certain way what we also been researching with Visible is also how all these practices also respond to the kind of let's say the products, the byproducts, the scenarios built by the modernist times, built by the growth of capitalism as the unique model that ruled every economy, and therefore, like in the practices that we have researched on, that we have connected to, there are always like similar questions reappearing, but many different formats trying to address them. So let's say we also decided like 3 years ago to include also a section about protest forms, because we also understood how the space of protest, it's not something we understood back then, but it was like we felt it was very important to like articulate also a connection between all the projects that were trying to use the space of protest as a space of emancipation and a space for creating alternatives or opportunities within the struggle. So from Quincy Gario with the Zwarte Piet movement, going to the Museum of Colored Women in the US, and many other projects. So this is, let's say, an ongoing thread that can be found within the archive. I don't think we answered the question though.
I just wanted to make a micro point to Anna Michela about trampoline, because of course she was asking about the US, but I think it's important for us who live in Europe to translate that question into our context. Just to say quickly that Trampoline House is a community center that's based in Copenhagen, but actually the first thing that they work with refugees and asylum seekers, but one of the main points which they treat is, in a way, how to reform Danish society, or how to pose the questions that are often posed the other way around to the white people who form and conform Danish society. So there is really a background work. For example, I had to speak up as a Trampoline House advocate, but also just personally, because I feel that it's easy for us right now as Europeans to turn to the US and kind of, think about the US, but actually some of these problems, we really do have them here at home. So, and some of the Visible projects are dealing with exactly those questions at the moment. So.
And I think also our institutional context is one of the most complex systems in that sense, where you have hierarchies, competitivity. In that sense, it's interesting also because it's really, we can start from this model also to question more and more, but we find it really in our daily work also very, very strongly.
We have another simple question, not simple at all, from Annika Marshall. And she is a theatre academic and emerging curator based between Glasgow and Aarhus. And she would love to hear more about what you make of the theatre terminology and concepts that are underlying your work. Everyone used terms like dramaturgy, acting, script, gesture, roles, as if, and so on. So how do you see the relation between theater practice and research and yours? She's interested in the concept of dramaturgy. Who wants to reply?
Well, I think that, you know, since the Society of Spectacle of the Bar, I mean, we are in a kind of paradigm that we cannot avoid thinking to the representational, as you know, as we said before, you know, even our democracy is representative. Therefore, there is a level of like staging of representatives, but also of ideas that need to be rehearsed and then need to be, you know, presented, and then, you know, this is not something we. Maybe I'm trying to answer. Maybe I will fail, but it's not something that we try, let's say, from scratch to say in an artificial way. We want to use the theater language and instruments to do this. It's more like understanding, as maybe I touched upon briefly before, how by wanting to occupy, let's say, the space of democracy, it's impossible not to like enter this kind of the language, use this kind of spaces, think about the kind of performativity that we all like assume. And I think also it's because these projects that we are dealing with are so immersed in the society and in the way in which things operate on a daily basis through you know, most of the projects also have, you know, assemblies within the project that take decisions. They have choices on how to represent themselves. There's a series of aspects that are definitely a constant rehearsal of democratic possibilities, let's say, and therefore, like, we couldn't be otherwise. You know, if we want to stay true to the kind of matter we are dealing with, we cannot then, you know, bring it back into like a curated display, but we need to really use the space of representation to, for instance, as Judith said before, the symbolic value of using a parliament is so important because it really allows this transition from the artistic system to another one, to one in which, you know, through the space of representation, things can also completely, let's say, unexpected things could happen, a completely unexpected link can come about. So this is the reason why I guess we refer so much to this language and words.
May I just add that actually, yes, Andrea's seminar tomorrow is very much along the roles and those questions and the performative theory. So Andrea, would you like just make a super short comment as a teaser for a discussion left tomorrow?
So please, thank you, Joanna. Tomorrow I trained as a theatre maker before I became a kind of curator's critical friend, or whatever I am now. And so my whole practice, my theoretical practice, is entirely informed by the intense political relation I see between staging in its broadest sense and forms of politics. And I think that translates anywhere. But very specifically tomorrow, if we have time, we might try and render via Zoom the last act of Brecht's Caucasian Chalk Circle. So if you want to come and, you know, help us with that, then please do.
There is another question. This one is for me. So I auto read this. Coming from Laura Burocco. Why are you referring to the curators being in the global north? And our issues coming from the global south. So this was a very specific reference to our experience, because as you can see, we are all connected from Europe, European cities, but as curators and within the Visible Award, we have worked with several artistic projects coming from other areas. For example, Nigeria, Mexico, India, Hong Kong, Australia, etc. So it was this global context coming to us with really an effort on going through the projects, really in one decolonized approach that is never simple, because we have different cultures. So it has been something totally related to this translocality. And this is why we are now working on a publication called Translocal Solidarity, because we were searching for forms that are sustainable and that could take place in different places. And we were also engaged into the knowledge coming from the artists that are based in that territories. Quite often coming from the global south, because for the urgencies that they are facing every day. So I could say that the urgencies was one of the main criteria for which this project have been selected within the Visible Award. I think, Pia, you were with the last question, and then we can close because it's 1 hour and 20 minutes. If there are no questions coming from the audience as well.
Yeah, sure. No, so the last question was just about sort of new forms and, you know, what. So we are, as Sara indicated, we're working on this publication related to translocal solidarity, and part of it also happens to do with, has to do with the idea that, you know, a book or a publication can move and cross borders when bodies can't. You know, there's still the possibility to ship things, and within the publication we have letters, which we see as sort of a slower way of exchanging ideas and not just focusing on a product, but focusing on reflection and actually solitude, sort of creating and thinking in solitude, but sharing that solitude. And then we have these interdisciplinary conversations where we bring in, you know, sociologists or care workers into engagement with artists and say that, you know, socially engaged art isn't just about an art, you know, UFO dropping down, but it's about actually coming from communities and coming from other contexts. And then the third thing is scores. So again, to say, you know, when resources may not be there, when the ability to bring artworks may not be there, how can we still be engaging with socially engaged art? So the question there is, you know, what, Matteo and Judith, you know, what have you been thinking, either in response to the book, you know, what ideas are now cooking in your brains related to that, or also to other forms right now in this time that aren't Zoom and that aren't meeting in person, but that are something else?
Do you want to start, Judith? Or?
I think for us, also this idea to work very much in the next years on storytelling and narration is a strong need, because we feel we are speaking all to the same people in a certain way very often. And it's really like about not becoming banal, but really to find new languages and find new ways to speak about this project. And in that sense, what we found very interesting was, as Matteo was already mentioning, this experience with the Parliament channel in Paris was really strong for us, because we were like also collaborating, who were doing the specific editing of because already we had to shrink down a project that is developed over years in a video of 3 minutes and in a text, and then this Parliament channel asked us again to shrink down it and to make it 1 minute, that it's going to that it can be disseminated through their social medias. So for us, it was really like, we were a little bit afraid, because we were saying, can we do that? And this is something that we would like really to experiment more, to explore more, because we think it's more and more important, not only to speak to our public, but really to speak to other publics, and in that sense, to have rather a partnership with a newspaper, with media, create media partnerships, really to challenge ourselves also in that sense, to speak to other people that are not from our class, not from our formation, not from our cultural background, that we can more share this also this potentiality also about these practices and art in general, because it can have a big impact and change our life. It's if it's in the right way embedded, but we still feel that there on the question of narration, and we are really stuck in a very small group, and we need to speak to others, and we need to convince others. I think also policymakers and experts of economy, which is already in a certain way the demand of, but we need also to be more prepared to open our ways to approach other communities and publics and partners and institutions. Again, also, it's interesting maybe not only work creating trans-institutional networks that are all this from the same typology, but really maybe also bring together a school and a museum, and maybe decide that they are buying an artwork and then they are showing it and giving it to a school. You know, to really to open up for us this question of that we have always this idea to miss a certain language or to connect to others is something, a big topic.
Yeah, and I think also like to talk about what is cooking. As Judith mentioned before, the award is stopped with the last edition, and now we are developing a platform for supporting projects throughout the years, and also with multiple grants, multiple fellowship, as we call them, situated fellowships. So to keep the money value high as it was before, but also like this opens up a new, let's say, perspective for us, because on one hand, of course, we want to make sure that we keep operating at a larger level through a network, ensuring the possibility that all these projects can continue, can have resources, and of course, sometimes this works more on a symbolic level of offering a grant, but other times also like pushing museums to make this consistent, or other art organization or other organization outside of the art world. But next to that, there is how do you create a storytelling that speaks about these changes in perspective, changes of narratives. And I think this goes back to the question that we didn't really answer about the anti-racist protest, and how the questions or the methodologies that we talked about relate to that. I think the most urgent thing is really to change the narratives, to change the subjects, to really have a strong shift in how things are told, who are telling things, and where do these stories end up. So this is really like what is pivotal at this moment. So that's why we are really interested in trying to help the idea that the storytelling of these projects can travel beyond the place where this project exists, and can become, as the examples that Judith mentioned, but also can really travel to other constituencies. We did that, for instance, just to mention some names, but it's always important what we did thanks to the Emily Jassir and Otobon Nekanga. We discussed a lot, and we ended up asking two renowned writers that have very little to do with art. In the case of Emily Jassir, it's Colum McCann, and in the case of Otobong is Elon Abila. And they are two writers, fictional writers that have usually an audience in the literature world. But the idea of having them writing the story of Emily or Darjasir or Otobong with a carved flow was really for us an eye-opening moment when we realized, this is the way to go. This is because, to really bridge all the gaps that kept artistic practice completely secluded from, other ways of talking about it, like a certain curatorial jargon that clouded things behind things that were not accessible anymore. But then all the potential of these projects many times got lost in the translation or the non-translation of things. So this is really something we truly believe in, and we really want to invest energies in really trying to change the narrative, because this really is tied to all the political struggles we are facing right now. Because if we change the narrative, if we change the access to information, if we are able to convey the incredible innovative ideas that we are dealing with to a larger public, then we are also contributing, making our part in contributing and at changing the balances through which you have a privilege of certain races, classes that is always imposed on others. So this is a little bit maybe to also answer that, to me at least, unanswered question.
There is the last question, because many people are asking for this. And coming from Apollonia Sustersik, she asked, thank you for the interesting discussion. How to not curate, how to not instrumentalize art for curatorial purposes. And the discussion is ongoing since I remember, since I'm part of the art contest from the late 80s, 90s. And together with the appearance of the phenomena of the freelance curator. And at the time, it was important to understand the curator as a discussion partner who shared similar beliefs as artists. Who wants to reply?
I don't know, for me, it's really like, I started to do my curatorial work in dialogue with an artist, with Michelangelo, and I continue to do that. And I'm thinking the most important thing is to listen, first of all, to what is about the ideas of the artist, the projects, and then taking care about how to create a fertile context also that these ideas can then grow. And if it's not that I very rarely, I don't like, for example, to give a fixed grid to commission artists, because I think it's much more interesting, for example, also with Visible, that we are in a certain way detecting, exploring, and looking for projects that are emerging from a very specific context, that are not responding to a curatorial request or to a curatorial frame, but it's just a need that the artist, about the need of the artist to react to a certain urgency or problematic, or which is going on, or which is for him interesting to develop or to question certain issues. So for me, it's a question also from which perspective you start. And from my personal choice, I like very much to start more from the artistic proposal and then adapt the curatorial frame. And in that sense, with Visible, we are working very much in this way, listening to the artists and understanding the needs. And also in the different parliament sessions, we kept always this idea of discussing, first of all, the criteria every 2 years, because it's so changing. It's so every 2 years we find it so different. We need to maybe to change also how we discuss this kind of practices. So in that sense, it's always something that evolves in relation with the artists, because maybe their needs that change.
I think also, like, I like Apollonia's question, because also it may feel the freelance curator as a virus to which no herd immunity was being developed. So, and in some way, the real virus there is the ego, in the sense that, the problem also of the curator is also the freelance curator is also like the idea of cultivating this idea of the self as necessarily, an activator of processes, a maître à penser, or a series of kind of guiding actions that are very misleading about what we can actually do as curators. So how not to curate is, for instance, to share curating with others. So what I think also for me was an incredible learning experience was to work with Judith for 10 years. and not to and always have this kind of balancing of different generations, different experiences, but coming together and always trying to make sure that we were balancing each other out for different reasons, of course. But the experience of curating collectively, and of course now we are two. Of course, with more people, it's more complicated, but why not? We did a jury all together, all the people that I see around my face now. So, this always keep the curatorial ego in check. And of course, it's not just because the curators is like an egomaniac. I mean, some are, of course, but it's also because, it's about reassessing every time where do we produce culture from and for whom. So therefore, when you have other people next to you, keeping in check, the fact that certain questions are constantly answered, a little bit like group material used to work. Imagine group material was made of amazing artistic personalities, Felix Gonzalez Torres, Tim Rollins, Doug Ashford, you name it, Julie Holt. But then, when they were in those meetings, there was always somebody like being a bit annoying and saying, okay, great idea, but who is it for? And you have this book, Show and Tell by Julie Holt, where you have all the minutes of their meetings, and they're amazing because you see how the artistic ego, and in some way the curatorial one is a secularized version of it, you have always like people keeping in check, or let's say artists checking on the other, like, okay, but who is this for? So let's always make sure that, we understand our role as activator of processes rather than initiator of things, and then people need to follow. So that would be my own experience also working collaboratively for 10 years and more.
So finish now. Also the level of attention, I think, of our invisible public audience is very strange also to speak among us with invisible participating. So I think that we say goodbye for today. We catch up tomorrow with Andrea, with the common seminar, the common Konstfack seminar of Andrea. So the link is always in the Facebook profile of CuratorLab, both in the event and both on the CuratorLab page for those who were lost in the web today and can find it. So it's at 6 p.m. Tomorrow with Andrea, and the seminar is Democracy and Dramaturgy, Modern Justice and Socially Engaged Artistic Practices. So again.
I also wanted to thank very much Matteo and Judith for all this process, and for taking us together, all these freelance curators becoming actually not independent, but maybe interdependent, and also creating this an amazing proximity with those 10 artist projects, because you become, as an advocate, also somebody so close and yet a critical friend, because then you really zoom in and see critical points. So you build some kind of completely different relation that we are used to, and that's fantastic in pushing out what can we understand as being curators. So you took us on this journey, and this journey continues from there. So thank you again for this year. And also wanted to say that actually it will be a natural continuation for the dilemmas that Andrea will bring on the table. So the dilemmas of the award, but also the contradictions between the dramaturgy and the democratic process, and the necessity of both tomorrow. So we are looking forward, Andrea, to reading and re-meeting again tomorrow at 6. And of course, thank you all CuratorLab participants for your energy and inputs and brilliance in this.
Same place, same time?
Yeah, exactly.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, thank you everyone for listening, joining in.
Thank you.